3. This room was too big, the ceiling was too high, and the doors were too tall. And the white carpet that went from wall to wall looked like a fresh fall of snow at Lake Arrowhead. There were full-length mirrors and crystal doodads all over the place. The ivory furniture had chromium on it. An enormous ivory drapes lay tumbled on the white carpet a yard from the windows. The white made the ivory look dirty, and the ivory made the white look bled out. The windows stared towards the darkened foothills. It was going to rain soon. There was pressure in the air already. I sat down at the edge of this deep, soft chair and looked at Mrs. Reagan. She was worth the stare. She was trouble. She was stretched out on a modernistic chaise longue with her slippers off. So I stared at her legs in the sheerest silk stockings. They seemed to be arranged to stare at. They were visible to the knee and one of them well beyond. The knees were dimpled, not bony and sharp. The calves were beautiful and the ankles long and slim and with enough melodic line for a tone poem. She was tall, rangy, and strong-looking. Her head was against an ivory satin cushion. Her hair was black and wiry and parted in the middle, and she had the hot black eyes of the portrait in the hall. She had a good mouth and a good chin. There was a sulky droop to her lips, and the lower lip was full. She had a drink. She took a swallow from it and gave me a cool, level stare over the rim of the glass. "So you're a private detective," she said. "I didn't know they really existed, except in books. Or else they were greasy little men snooping around hotels." There was nothing in that for me, so I let it drift with the current. She put her glass down on the flat arm of the chaise longue and flashed an emerald and touched her hair. She said slowly, "How did you like Dad?" "I liked him," I said. "He liked Rusty. I suppose you know who Rusty is." "Uh-huh." "Rusty was earthly and vulgar at times, but he was very real. And he was a lot of fun for Dad. Rusty shouldn't have gone off like that. Dad feels very badly about it, although he won't say so. Or did he?" "He said something about it." "You're not much of a gusher, are you, Mr. Marlowe?" "But he wants to find him, doesn't he?" I stared at her politely through a pause. "Yes and no," I said. "That's hardly an answer. Do you think you can find him?" "I didn't say I was going to try. Why not try the Missing Persons Bureau? They have an organization. It's not just a one-man job." "Oh, Dad wouldn't hear of the police being brought into this." She looked at me smoothly across her glass again, emptied it, and rang a bell. A maid came into the room by the side door. She was a middle-aged woman with a long, yellow, gentle face, a long nose, no chin, large, wet eyes. She looked like a nice old horse that had been turned out to pasture after long service. Mrs. Reagan waved the empty glass at her, and she mixed another drink and handed it to her and left the room, without a word, without a glance in my direction. When the door shut, Mrs. Reagan said, "Well, how will you go about it then?" "How and when did he skip out?" "Didn't Dad tell you?" I grinned at her with my head on one side. She flushed. Her hot black eyes looked mad. "I don't see what there is to be cagey about," she snapped. "And I don't like your manners." "I'm not too crazy about yours," I said. "I didn't ask to see you. You sent for me. I don't mind your ritzing me or drinking your lunch through a scotch bottle. I don't mind your showing me your legs. They're very swell legs, and it's a pleasure to make their acquaintance. I don't mind if you don't like my manners. They're pretty bad. I grieve over them during the long winter evenings. But don't waste your time trying to cross-examine me." She slammed her glass down so hard that it sloped over on an ivory cushion. She swung her legs to the floor and stood up with her eyes sparking fire and her nostrils wide. Her mouth was open and her bright teeth glared at me. Her knuckles were white. "People don't talk like that to me," she said thickly. I sat there and grinned at her. Very slowly, she closed her mouth and looked down at the spilled liquor. She sat down on the edge of the chaise longue and cupped her chin in one hand. "My God, you dark, handsome brute. I ought to draw a Buick at you." I snicked a match on my thumbnail, and for once it lit. I puffed smoke into the air and waited. "I loathe masterful men," she said. "I simply loathe them. Just what is it you're afraid of, Mrs. Reagan? Her eyes whitened. Then they darkened until they seemed to be all pupil. Her nostrils looked pinched. That wasn't what he wanted with you at all, she said, in a strained voice that still had shreds of anger clinging to me. About Rusty, was it? Better ask him, she flared up again. Get out! Damn you, get out! I stood up. Sit down, she snapped. I sat down. I flicked a finger at my palm and waited. Please, she said. Please, you could find Rusty if Dad wanted you to. That didn't work either. I nodded and asked, when did he go? One afternoon a month back, he just drove away in his car without saying a word. They found the car in a private garage somewhere. They? She got cunning. Her whole body seemed to go lax. Then she smiled at me winningly. He didn't tell you then. Her voice was almost gleeful, as if she had outsmarted me. Maybe she had. He told me about Mr. Reagan. Yes, that's not what he wanted to see me about. Is that what you've been trying to get me to say? I'm sure I don't care what you say. I stood up again. Then I'll be running along. She didn't speak. I went over to the tall white door I had come in at. When I looked back, she had her lip between her teeth and was worrying it like a puppy at a fringe of a rug. I went out, down the tile staircase to the hall, and the butler drifted out of somewhere with my hat in his hand. I put it on while he opened the door for me. You made a mistake, I said. Mrs. Reagan didn't want to see me. He inclined his silver head and said politely, I'm sorry, sir. I make many mistakes. He closed the door against my back. I stood on the step breathing my cigarette smoke and looking down a succession of terraces with flower beds and trimmed trees to the high iron fence with gilt spears that hemmed in the estate. A winding driveway dropped down between the retaining walls to the open iron gates. Beyond the fence, the hill sloped for several miles. On the lower level, faint and far off, I could just barely see some of the old wooden derricks of the oil fields from which the Sternwoods had made their money. Most of the field was public park now, cleaned up and donated to the city by General Sternwood, but a little of it was still producing in groups of wells pumping 5 to 6 barrels a day. The Sternwoods, having moved up the hill, could no longer smell the stale sump water or the oil, but they could still look out of their front windows and see what had made them rich, if they wanted to. I didn't suppose they would want to. I walked down the brick path from terrace to terrace, followed along inside the fence and so out of the gate, so where I had left my car under a pepper tree on the street. Thunder was crackling in the foothills now, and the sky above them was purple-black. It was going to rain hard. The air had a damp foretaste of rain. I put the top up on my convertible before I started downtown. She had lovely legs. I would say that for her. There were a couple of pretty smooth citizens. She and her father. He was probably just trying me out. The job he had given me was a lawyer's job. Even if Mr. Arthur Gwynne Geiger, rare books and deluxe editions, turned out to be a blackmailer, it was still a lawyer's job, unless there was a lot more to it than met the eye. At a casual glance, I thought I might have a lot of fun finding out. I drove down to the Hollywood Public Library and did a little superficial research in a stuffy volume called Famous First Editions. Half an hour of it made me need my lunch.